Jake Lawson had always taken pride in his sprawling ranch, a patch of open land steeped in family history, where the wide blue skies and rugged terrain offered both solace and livelihood. A third-generation rancher, Jake's days revolved around caring for his herd, maintaining old barns, and preserving traditions passed down from his ancestors. Every corner of his property, from the weathered barn that housed decades of memories to the ancient oak tree that had stood as a silent witness to the passage of time, held deep personal significance. This ranch was more than just land. It was his legacy and his sanctuary. But all that peace was about to be shattered by an unwelcome force in the community. Kerren, the self-styled queen of the local homeowners association, HOA. Known throughout the county simply as HOA Kerren, she prided herself on enforcing an arbitrary set of rules that dictated every aspect of life on the ranches and estates under the HOA's dubious jurisdiction. Kerren's idea of community standards extended even into the private corners of residents' lives, transforming a beloved oak into a potential target for her relentless pursuit of conformity. The tension first surfaced on a clear autumn afternoon when Jake was out checking on his livestock near the ancient oak tree, a centerpiece of his property that had stood for over 100 years. Without warning, a sleek black SUV pulled up along the dusty road, and out stepped Kerren, clipboard in hand and an expression of self-righteous determination painted across her face. "Mr. Lawson," she began in a clipped tone that brooked no argument, "I regret to inform you that your oak tree is in violation of our community's landscaping standards." Jake, taken aback, asked, "Violation? This tree has stood here since my grandfather planted it. It's part of this land's history." Kerren's eyes narrowed as she replied, "Rules are rules. The tree's overgrowth poses an aesthetic hazard, and you are required to trim it immediately or face further consequences." Her words carried the weight of bureaucratic authority, yet to Jake they rang hollow. The oak was not merely an ornamental feature. It was the very heart of his ranch, a living relic of his family's past. Their conversation quickly escalated into a confrontation. Jake maintained that the tree not only added character, but was a natural part of the ecosystem his ancestors had cherished. Kerren, however, dismissed his pleas as outdated sentimentalism. "I'm issuing you a final warning," she declared, pressing a printed notice into his hand. "Fail to comply, and the HOA will enforce the rules by any means necessary." As Kerren walked away with a self-satisfied smile, Jake felt a mix of disbelief and determination. This was not just about a tree. It was about the intrusion of a power-hungry administrator into the very fabric of his life. That evening, as the sun set over the expansive ranch, Jake sat on the porch of his farmhouse and contemplated the injustice. How could an HOA claim jurisdiction over something so personal? It was then he resolved that he would not be bullied out of protecting his legacy. Word of the confrontation soon spread among neighboring ranchers and homeowners. Many shared stories of minor infractions turned into full-blown disputes, each incident underscoring the absurdity of Kerren's relentless overreach. While some were too intimidated to speak out, Jake's resolve only hardened with each passing whisper. His ranch, its sprawling fields, its ancient oak, and its proud barn was a testament to a way of life that could not be dictated by a self-appointed enforcer of petty rules. In the quiet solitude of the night, as crickets sang and the rustle of wind through the trees filled the air, Jake made a silent vow. He would stand up for his rights and the rights of every homeowner whose voice was being stifled by Kerren's autocratic measures. The stage had been set for a long and arduous battle, a battle for the soul of a community where tradition and freedom were at stake. The very next morning, Jake awoke to an unwelcome surprise, a thick envelope taped to his farmhouse door. Bearing the official seal of the HOA, it was a formal notice of violation, accusing him of neglecting landscaping standards and demanding that he remove or severely trim his oak tree. The fine attached was steep, a punitive measure designed to force compliance and intimidate even the most steadfast of property owners. Stepping outside into the crisp morning air, Jake found Kerren waiting by the pickup truck parked on his gravel driveway. With her arms crossed and a smug expression, she stated matter-of-factly, "Mr. Lawson, These rules are not suggestions. You must abide by them, or face the full force of the HOA's regulations. Her tone brooked no debate. Despite the sting of the fine, Jake kept his cool. Drawing on years of hard-earned experience, he countered, "This oak has been here for generations. It's a living piece of my family's heritage, and it isn't harming anyone." But Kerren was unmoved. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Lawson," she said coolly. "I'm not interested in your sentimental arguments. Either comply or further action will be taken." That afternoon, as Jake pored over local zoning laws and property rights documents, he discovered that many of the HOA's standards were ambiguous at best. Determined to defend his property, he filed a formal complaint with the local zoning office, citing clear legal protections for his historic tree. Yet, before his case could be reviewed, the pressure intensified. Within hours, local inspectors arrived at his ranch, clipboards in hand. They combed every inch of his property, scrutinizing the tree, the barn, and even the fence lines, searching for any infraction that could be used as leverage. Kerren, ever the self-appointed overseer, trailed behind the inspectors, her eyes fixed on Jake's every move. "You see, Mr. Lawson," she said as they passed by the ancient oak, "we're simply enforcing the community standards. If you don't cooperate, the next step might be the removal of unsightly features from your property." Each word was a veiled threat, designed to break his resolve. Throughout the day, Jake documented every interaction. He snapped photographs of the inspectors at work, recorded snippets of Kerren's haughty remarks, and logged the exact times of their visits. Every piece of evidence bolstered his belief that the HOA's actions were less about safety or community aesthetics and more about control. The fine, the inspection, and Kerren's incessant hovering were all part of a campaign of intimidation. As dusk fell, the mounting pressure left Jake with a mix of frustration and resolve. His private ranch, his sanctuary, was under siege by an institution that sought to mold every aspect of his life according to a rigid, outmoded vision. But Jake was not one to back down. That night, as he reviewed his documentation, he vowed to expose the arbitrary nature of these rules and the overreaching authority of HOA Kerren. Outside his farmhouse, the ranch was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of the wind through the fields. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, Jake's determination was simmering. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would dig deeper into the loopholes and inconsistencies in the HOA's regulations. He would reach out to neighbors who had suffered similar fates and begin to build a coalition against this encroaching tyranny. The first power move from the HOA had only solidified Jake's resolve. With the fine as a bitter reminder of the price of defiance, he prepared himself for a long battle, one where he would fight not only for his oak tree, but for the right of every homeowner to live freely on their own land. In the days following the initial confrontation, the pressure from the HOA escalated in a manner that left the entire community on edge. Kerren's tactics grew ever more draconian, and whispers of her overreach echoed through the local ranching community. Neighbors began to report similar incidents, minor infractions blown out of proportion, fines levied for trivial matters, and an increasing number of anonymous complaints filed against those who dared to challenge the status quo. Jake soon noticed a disturbing pattern. At local barbecues and in quiet conversations at the feed store, ranchers discussed how Kerren would call inspectors for the slightest deviation, from a crooked fence post to a stray weed in someone's yard. One longtime neighbor confided, "I've seen her out there, clipboard in hand, prowling like a hawk, ready to pounce on anyone who doesn't toe the line." This wasn't just about a tree anymore. It was a systematic campaign to impose an oppressive uniformity across the community. Determined to uncover the full extent of the HOA's corruption, Jake began an undercover investigation. Late one night, he set up a discreet camera aimed at the edge of his property, the same area where the oak tree stood proud. Over several nights, he recorded the comings and goings of strange visitors. Inspectors arriving unannounced, Kerren's aides whispering among themselves, and even a few moments where a vehicle with an unfamiliar logo lingered near his barn. These images confirmed his growing suspicions that Kerren was orchestrating a far-reaching campaign of intimidation. During a particularly tense board meeting called on short notice, Jake attended armed with a thick folder of his collected evidence. In that meeting, a few board members, long-suffering individuals who had quietly endured Kerren's arbitrary demands, began to question her decisions. One whispered remark, "Fines mysteriously vanish when certain donations are made to the HOA fund," hinted at a financial mismanagement that went beyond enforcing community standards. Jake listened as one sympathetic board member, whose identity he kept confidential, slid him an envelope containing internal memos and bank records. The documents revealed that Kerren had been siphoning off HOA funds to pay for personal luxuries, a secret that explained her relentless drive to impose even more draconian measures. With every new piece of evidence, Jake's resolve strengthened. He meticulously logged every incident, every suspicious meeting, and every unexplained fine, determined to build an airtight case against Kerren and the corrupt practices of the HOA. At the next community forum, a gathering of frustrated ranchers and homeowners, Jake took the stage. With a calm but forceful voice, he presented his evidence: the unannounced inspections, the falsified records, and the internal memos that exposed the misuse of funds. "This isn't just about one tree," he declared. "It's about an abuse of power that affects every one of us who call this land home." The room filled with murmurs of agreement as residents realized that they were not alone in their struggle. Yet Kerren refused to back down. At the meeting, she dismissed Jake's claims as exaggerations and insisted that the rules were clear and non-negotiable. "I am merely upholding community standards," she argued, her tone increasingly defensive. But as Jake's evidence mounted, even some of her staunchest allies began to waver. The board members who had once blindly supported her now looked uncertain, their loyalty shaken by the undeniable proof of corruption. Outside the meeting hall, in the cool evening air, neighbors gathered in small groups to discuss what they had just heard. It became clear that the seeds of dissent had been sown. What had started as a personal battle over an ancient oak was evolving into a larger movement, a quiet but determined resistance against the arbitrary tyranny of the HOA. That night, as Jake pored over the latest footage from his hidden camera, he realized that the conflict had moved well beyond a simple dispute. Kerren's actions were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic plan to control every facet of life on the ranches. And so, with a deep sense of purpose, Jake began to plan his counterattack, one that would expose the full extent of the corruption and force the community to reclaim its rights. The situation reached a boiling point when Kerren orchestrated her most audacious stunt yet. Determined to demonstrate her power once and for all, she ordered the removal of the historic oak tree, a symbolic act meant to send a message that not even a family heirloom was safe from her diktats. On a fateful morning, without warning, a crew of contractors arrived at Jake's ranch. In a frenzy of chainsaws and heavy machinery, the oak was cut down. But what followed was even more catastrophic. The felled tree, in a twist of fate, came crashing down and tore through the side of Jake's barn. The crash was deafening, a combination of splintering wood and collapsing beams, and left the once sturdy barn in ruins. Neighbors rushed over, horrified at the sight of the barn reduced to a mangled heap. For Jake, it was not just property damage. It was an assault on his heritage and livelihood. The barn, a repository of memories and tools that had sustained his ranching operations for decades, lay in ruins as a direct result of Kerren's reckless overreach. As word of the disaster spread, Kerren attempted to spin the incident as a necessary corrective measure in the name of community aesthetics. In a press statement issued later that day, she claimed that the tree was a hazard and that its removal was mandated by new guidelines. But the evidence was irrefutable. Neighbors recounted how the contractors had arrived without proper authorization and that the timing of the operation was suspiciously close to Kerren's recent warnings. Fueled by a mix of grief and righteous anger, Jake knew that it was time to strike back in a way that would leave no doubt about the injustice he had suffered. He gathered the photographs of the wreckage, videos of the contractors at work, and the incongruous press statement, all of which painted a damning picture of an HOA abusing its power. Then, drawing on a reservoir of community support, Jake organized a public demonstration at the site of the ruined barn. At the gathering, frustrated ranchers and neighbors joined Jake as he detailed the events. "This isn't just about a tree," he declared. "It's about our right to live on our own land without being bullied by an HOA that cares more about appearances than our heritage." His voice carried across the assembled crowd, and for the first time, many realized the extent of Kerren's overreach. Some board members, emboldened by the undeniable evidence, began to voice their own criticisms of her actions. Kerren, who had intended her stunt to reassert her authority, found herself increasingly cornered. At the next HOA meeting, Jake arrived with a thick folder of legal documents and evidence showing that the tree removal was not only unauthorized, but had directly led to the destruction of his barn. The room fell silent as Jake methodically laid out his case, citing local zoning laws, property rights, and the recorded testimonies of witnesses. "You see," he said firmly, "when rules are enforced arbitrarily, lives and legacies are ruined." Kerren's usual smirk faltered as murmurs of disapproval spread among the attendees. Even longtime supporters of the HOA began to question whether the enforcement of these rules was truly in the community's best interest. Desperate to salvage her crumbling authority, Kerren attempted to deflect blame, arguing that the accident was an unfortunate misadventure of enforcing standards. But the damage was done. The public confrontation had exposed the sheer callousness of her methods. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the balance of power was shifting. Neighbors voiced their support for Jake, and several board members indicated that they no longer wished to be complicit in Kerren's authoritarian rule. As the meeting adjourned in a haze of dissent and disillusionment, Jake stood resolute, a symbol of the fight for personal freedom and community integrity. That day, as he surveyed the wreckage of his barn and the shocked faces of his neighbors, Jake vowed that he would not let this injustice pass. His counterattack had struck a chord, and the community was beginning to see that Kerren's draconian measures were nothing more than a thin veil over a deeper corruption. The stage was now set for the final showdown, a battle that would decide whether the voices of the many could overcome the tyranny of one. Cornered by mounting evidence and a rapidly disintegrating support system, Kerren decided to make one last desperate bid to retain her authority. Late one rainy evening, as thunder rumbled ominously overhead, she called an emergency meeting at the HOA headquarters. Her message was clear. Any further dissent would be met with severe legal action and, if necessary, physical enforcement. In her mind, this was her final stand, a last-ditch effort to assert control before her carefully constructed regime crumbled entirely. News of the emergency meeting spread quickly throughout the community. Jake, now armed with an even larger dossier of evidence, received a frantic phone call from a neighbor warning him of Kerren's plans. Determined not to let her final gambit go unchallenged, Jake gathered all his documentation, including video footage of the tree being felled, photographs of the wrecked barn, and sworn statements from local witnesses, and prepared to confront her once more. The meeting took place in a drab, poorly lit conference room at the HOA office. Kerren, dressed in a sharply tailored suit that belied her inner panic, opened the session by issuing a series of intimidating ultimatums. "This is your final warning," she announced, her voice quivering with forced authority. "Anyone who continues to oppose the HOA's directives will face immediate legal action, fines, eviction, and if necessary, the full force of the law." Her words, intended to inspire fear, instead only galvanized the room. As she droned on, Jake interrupted with a calm, steady voice. "Kerren, your actions have not only destroyed property, but have also shattered the trust of this community. I have documented every illegal move, from the unauthorized tree removal to the destruction of my barn, and I will not allow your tyranny to continue." His words hung in the air as murmurs of agreement erupted among the other board members and residents present. In a moment of desperation, Kerren reached for her phone and attempted to call the police, claiming that she was under threat and that the meeting was under attack by unruly protesters. But before she could complete her call, a recorded conversation, captured by one of Jake's hidden cameras, played over the speakers. The recording featured one of Kerren's own aides admitting to falsifying inspection reports and deliberately misinforming residents about the proper guidelines. The room fell into stunned silence. The evidence was irrefutable, and even some of her staunch allies began to waver. Realizing that her last resort was crumbling, Kerren's voice turned frantic. "This is defamation. I will sue anyone who spreads these lies," she cried, her words echoing off the stark walls of the conference room. But as the meeting devolved into chaos, with board members openly challenging her and residents demanding accountability, the tide had turned irrevocably. In a final chaotic moment, as police officers arrived in response to the earlier call, Kerren's desperate measures were laid bare. The officers took statements from several witnesses, while Jake calmly handed over his evidence for review. The atmosphere was electric with the realization that Kerren's abuse of power had reached its end. Her final, desperate move had not only failed to intimidate, but had instead exposed her for the manipulative tyrant she truly was. That night, as the meeting adjourned amidst a storm of dissent and the echo of sirens in the distance, Jake stood at the threshold of the HOA office with a look of quiet triumph. The community's support was palpable, and the evidence against Kerren was now insurmountable. Her final gambit had sealed her fate, and the beginning of the end for the corrupt regime that had plagued the neighborhood for far too long. In the days that followed Kerren's public debacle, the foundation of her authority crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence and a growing outcry from the community. A special town hall meeting was convened at a local community center, and it quickly became clear that the residents had had enough. With voices raised and united in their demand for change, the community voted overwhelmingly to remove Kerren from her position as HOA president. The old board, complicit in her authoritarian tactics, was dismissed, and a new interim committee was elected by the people. At the meeting, Jake presented a comprehensive report outlining every instance of misconduct. The unauthorized tree cutting, the catastrophic damage to his barn, the bogus fines, and the falsified records, all supported by photographs, video footage, and sworn testimonies. "Today," Jake declared, "we take back control of our community and restore our right to live freely on our own land." His words were met with thunderous applause and a palpable sense of vindication from the assembled homeowners. Local authorities soon followed up on the community's uprising. The state's Consumer Protection Agency and local law enforcement launched investigations into the HOA's practices. Headlines in regional newspapers blared, "HOA tyrant ousted. Community reclaims its heritage." Within days, Kerren's personal assets came under scrutiny, and her once stately ranch home was quickly listed for auction. Rumors abounded that she would be forced to pay fines and legal fees that would bankrupt her. For Jake, the victory was bittersweet. Although the removal of Kerren marked the end of her reign of terror, the damage to his barn, and the emotional toll of seeing his cherished property desecrated would take time to heal. Yet, as neighbors gathered to console one another and plan for the rebuilding of their community, Jake felt a renewed sense of hope. The oppressive days were finally over. The new interim board, comprised of respected, community-minded individuals, vowed to reform the HOA from the ground up. They pledged transparency, accountability, and most importantly, respect for the rights of every homeowner. In the months that followed, community meetings became forums for open dialogue, where grievances were aired and decisions were made collectively, without the heavy-handed interference of a single individual. Every morning, as Jake sipped his coffee on the rebuilt porch of his farmhouse and gazed over the recovering landscape of his ranch, he felt a sense of pride. The barn might have been ruined, but the spirit of the community was now unbreakable. Neighbors came together to help rebuild structures, share resources, and most importantly, remind each other that no one, no matter how entitled, could trample on their collective rights. As the interim board set in motion plans for long-term reforms, the memory of Kerren's tyranny began to fade into a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. For Jake, the victory was not just about a ruined barn or a fallen tree, but about reclaiming the dignity and freedom that had been under siege for too long. In the wake of the community uprising, local and state authorities moved swiftly to hold the old HOA accountable. The newly reformed interim board cooperated fully with investigations into the widespread corruption and abuse of power that had characterized Kerren's tenure. Public hearings were scheduled, and homeowners, armed with Jake's evidence and their own testimonies, took the stand. The state's Consumer Protection Agency fined the previous HOA for its unauthorized enforcement of arbitrary rules and for the misappropriation of funds that had fueled Kerren's extravagant measures. Lawsuits were filed on behalf of dozens of affected homeowners, and several former board members faced charges related to fraud and corruption. In a landmark ruling, the court ordered that the HOA's funds be frozen pending further investigation, effectively dissolving the old structure and mandating a complete overhaul. Jake's role in exposing the abuse of power was widely lauded. His methodical documentation and unwavering persistence had not only brought justice to his own ranch, but it also paved the way for sweeping reforms that would protect every homeowner's rights in the future. In every public hearing he attended, he reiterated the simple truth that no one should have to live under tyranny, regardless of the supposed community standards set by an unaccountable few. The final blow came when the state bar announced an investigation into Kerren's personal attorney, a longtime associate who had helped shield her actions through dubious legal maneuvers. With mounting evidence and growing public support for reform, Kerren's attempts to evade accountability were over. The legal consequences for the corrupt practices of the old HOA were now fully in motion, and the community could finally begin to heal. As the legal noose tightened, Kerren's personal life unraveled at an alarming pace. Public opinion turned decisively against her, and the once feared HOA Kerren became a symbol of arrogance and abuse of power. Mounting fines, legal fees, and asset seizures forced her to liquidate properties, and her once stately home was sold at auction. The media relentlessly chronicled her downfall, and former allies distanced themselves from the tarnished figure she had become. In a final twist of poetic justice, Jake encountered Kerren months later in a setting that underscored her fall from grace. Now stripped of her former title and forced to take a modest position as an assistant property manager for a small, struggling HOA in a neighboring town, she was a shadow of the authoritative figure she once embodied. In a brief, chance encounter in a crowded office corridor, their eyes met. With a quiet, knowing smile, Jake remarked, "I hope you enjoy following the rules this time." His words, delivered without malice but filled with finality, were met by a stunned silence from Kerren, who could do nothing but lower her gaze. It was a moment of poetic justice, a fitting end to her reign of intimidation. In the months that followed, the community began to rebuild, not just structures, but trust and a renewed spirit of collaboration. The reformed HOA, now a model of transparency and fairness, held regular open meetings where every resident's voice was valued. The memory of the ruined barn and the felled oak tree became bittersweet symbols of the struggle for autonomy and respect. Jake returned to his ranch with a sense of peace that had long been elusive. Every morning, as he watched the sun rise over the rolling fields and the rebuilt barn stood as a testament to resilience, neighbors would pass by and share a knowing nod. At community gatherings, residents would joke about the legend of HOA Kerren, a cautionary tale that reminded everyone that tyranny could be overthrown by unity. One sunny afternoon, as Jake relaxed on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand, a longtime neighbor strolled by holding a mock HOA violation notice for having excessively historic property. With a chuckle and a shake of his head, Jake replied, "They really tried, didn't they?" His remark, light and full of genuine amusement, encapsulated the newfound spirit of the community, a spirit defined by freedom, resilience, and a well-earned sense of humor. As dusk fell over the ranch, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from a nearby community cookout, the final images were of families gathering together, rebuilding not only structures, but the bonds of trust. The legacy of Kerren's downfall would live on as a reminder that no one, no matter how entitled, could subdue the spirit of a united community. Fade to black as Jake's silhouette is seen on his porch, a quiet smile on his face, knowing that true freedom and laughter had finally prevailed.